The day I turned 17, my stepfather gave me a firm handshake and said, "You're practically a man now." My mother didn't look up from her phone. That should have told me everything I needed to know. My name is Caleb. I'm 28 now. And I'm telling you this story because I still think about that hospital room sometimes. The sound of the machines, the smell of antiseptic, and the moment I heard my mother's voice through the thin curtain telling the doctor she didn't have time to deal with this tonight. I was unconscious, or at least she thought I was. Let me back up. My father, Daniel, died when I was 9. Pancreatic cancer, fast and brutal. One summer he was coaching my Little League team, and by Thanksgiving he was gone. He left behind a small life insurance policy, a beat-up Ford pickup I wasn't old enough to drive, and me. My mother, Renata, was 34, reasonably attractive, and, as I would learn later, completely uninterested in raising a child on her own. She met my stepfather, Gary, 14 months after my father's funeral. They were married 11 months after that. Gary had 2 kids from his first marriage, a daughter named Priya, 16, and a son named Marcus, 13. When we all moved into Gary's house in Scottsdale, Arizona, I became the odd number in an even equation. I want to be fair here. Gary wasn't cruel to me. He was just indifferent in the specific way that some men are indifferent to things that don't belong to them. He never hit me. He never screamed at me. He just looked through me, the way you look through a window when you're focused on something outside. His kids got new cars when they turned 16. I got a bus pass and a reminder that money didn't grow on trees. Priya's cheerleading competitions meant the whole family drove 4 hours to watch. My track meets conflicted with family plans twice and were quietly dropped from the calendar. My mother followed his lead. I don't know if she loved Gary more than she loved me, or if she was just exhausted from years of single parenting and finally relieved to hand the wheel to someone else. Either way, somewhere around my 13th birthday, I stopped expecting much from her. By 17, I had learned to operate like a satellite in a distant orbit, present enough to avoid conflict, far enough away not to get hurt. The one person who never made me feel like background noise was my father's dad, my grandfather Warren. He lived 40 minutes away in Mesa, in the same house my father had grown up in. Every other Sunday, I would take the bus out there, and we'd sit on his back porch and eat whatever he'd grilled. Usually chicken thighs with this lemon pepper rub he'd been making since 1987. And he'd ask me about school, about running, about what I was reading. Real questions. The kind where he actually waited for the answer. He was the one who told me my father had been a runner too. Told me about the state championship my dad nearly won in 1989, how he'd pulled a hamstring in the final 100 meters and still finished third. He was stubborn like that, my grandfather said, smiling at the sky. Once he started something, he finished it. He looked at me when he said that, and I understood it was meant for me too. I ran cross country and track for Scottsdale Central High School. I was good. Not college scholarship good, but genuinely good. The kind of good that gets you team captain and a small write-up in the local paper. Running was the one place I felt completely clear. No stepfather, no invisible mother, no borrowed house where I slept in a room that used to be Gary's home office, and still had the faint rectangular shadows on the wall where his diplomas used to hang. The night everything changed was a Friday in late October of my junior year. Gary's company was celebrating some kind of quarterly milestone, and he'd rented out a private room at a steakhouse in North Scottsdale. Spouses and families were invited. My mother wore a black dress I'd never seen before and spent 45 minutes on her hair. Marcus and Priya dressed up. I wore the one button-down shirt I owned and felt like a stranger at someone else's party, which, honestly, I was. The dinner was fine in the way that those things are fine. Loud, expensive, full of adults talking about things I had no context for. I ate a steak that cost more than my monthly allowance, drank 2 Cokes, and counted the minutes. By 9:30, Gary's colleagues were getting louder, and the room was filling with the particular energy of adults who've had enough wine to forget their children are watching. My mother leaned over to me around 10 and said, in a voice that made it clear this was not a suggestion, that she and Gary were going to stay another hour or 2, and that I should take an Uber home. She handed me her credit card. Priya was staying with a friend. Marcus was asleep in a chair in the corner, which somehow didn't seem to concern anyone. I said, okay. I called the Uber. I left. What happened next took less than 4 seconds. The Uber was a gray Honda. A guy named Troy, who had a Pine air freshener and a podcast playing low. We were on Scottsdale Road, about 2 miles from Gary's house, when a lifted pickup truck ran a red light at a cross street and hit us on the passenger side, my side, at what the police report later estimated was approximately 52 miles per hour. I remember the sound. I remember the spinning. I don't remember anything else for a long time after that. I woke up to beeping. There was a light above me, very white and very steady. And for a moment I thought I was looking up at the sky on a cloudy day. Then the pain introduced itself, a deep, grinding pressure in my left side and a sharp heat across my collarbone. And the sky became a hospital ceiling and the beeping became a monitor, and I understood where I was. I couldn't move my left arm. There was a tube in my right hand. I tried to speak, and what came out was a sound I didn't recognize as my own voice. A nurse appeared, young, with dark hair pulled back, and the specific calm expression of someone trained to manage panic. She told me not to try to sit up. She told me I was at Scottsdale Memorial. She told me I'd been in an accident and that I was stable now, but that it had been, her words, a serious night. Serious night. I turned that phrase over in my head for a moment. My mother, I said. My voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. We've been in contact with your family, she said, and then she adjusted something on the monitor and told me the doctor would be in shortly and left before I could ask anything else. The doctor came. His name was Dr. Okafor, and he had the kind of steady, unhurried manner that made you trust him immediately. He told me I had 3 fractured ribs, a lacerated spleen, a broken collarbone, and a moderate concussion. The spleen was the problem. There was internal bleeding that had been controlled for now, but he said I needed surgery, not optional, not eventually now, to repair it properly before it worsened. He needed consent from my legal guardian to proceed. He had been trying to reach my mother for 2 hours. I closed my eyes. I was not surprised, exactly. I was something worse than surprised. I was unsurprised in the way that only happens when something confirms a fear you've been carrying so long it has become part of your internal architecture. I can keep trying, Dr. Okafor said, and I could hear something careful in his voice, the professional restraint of a man who had opinions he was not going to share with a 17-year-old patient. She'll answer, I said. I believed it when I said it. She did answer. Eventually. I know what happened in that conversation because Dr. Okafor told my grandfather about it later, and my grandfather told me when he decided I was old enough to hear it without it breaking something inside me. My mother had answered the phone from the steakhouse. There was noise in the background. Dr. Okafor explained the situation, the internal bleeding, the fractured ribs, the necessity of surgery, the time sensitivity. He explained that he needed her to come in and sign consent forms, or at minimum provide verbal authorization that could be documented. My mother said, and I am telling you these exact words because my grandfather repeated them to me word for word, and I have never forgotten them. He's a healthy kid. He'll be fine. I'm in the middle of something. Can this wait until morning? Dr. Okafor told her it could not wait until morning. My mother said, then do whatever you have to do. I'm not driving across town at 10:30 for paperwork. Dr. Okafor explained that it was not that simple, that he needed legal authorization, that without it, he was limited in what interventions he could perform, that this was a genuine medical emergency. My mother said, I don't know what you want me to tell you. He's not my only responsibility tonight. He's not my only responsibility tonight. I was unconscious when this conversation happened, or close enough to it that the details reached me like sounds from another room, muffled, indistinct, but unmistakable in their shape. I know that's hard to explain. But there is a particular kind of awareness that exists just below the surface of consciousness, especially when the body is under trauma, and I heard enough. I heard my mother's name. I heard the doctor's voice change. I heard a word that sounded like guardian. My grandfather arrived at 11:47. I know the exact time because there's a clock on the wall above the door in those hospital rooms, and I had been staring at it for the better part of an hour when the door opened and he walked in. He was wearing jeans and a flannel shirt, and he had clearly dressed in a hurry because the shirt was unevenly buttoned. But he walked in like a man who had somewhere to be and had arrived. He looked at me, and his face did the thing that his face sometimes did, a tightening around the eyes, a brief moment where something moved across his expression before he controlled it. Hey, bud, he said. I said, how did you... Hospital called your mother. Your mother didn't come. Hospital called your emergency contact list. He pulled a chair to the side of my bed without being asked. You put me as your secondary emergency contact last year. Remember? You had to fill out that school sports physical form. I had put him on that form without thinking too much about it. The primary was my mother, as required. The secondary, the person to call if the primary was unavailable or unresponsive, was my grandfather. I had written his name and number in that box the same way I did everything that mattered to me, quietly, without making a big deal of it, because there was no one in my immediate household to make a big deal with. He had been called at 11:15. He had been in the car by 11:18. He found Dr. Okafor at the nurse's station, and they spoke for a few minutes in the hallway. I watched through the window in my door. I couldn't hear the words, but I could read the posture. My grandfather listening, nodding, his jaw set. Then he signed something. Then he came back in and sat down and said, "They're taking you into surgery in about 40 minutes. I'm going to be right here." What did she say? I asked. I already knew, in the way you sometimes know things before you're ready to know them. But I needed to hear it said out loud. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the clock. Then he looked at me and said, "She said she was busy." He said it simply, without bitterness, which somehow made it worse and better at the same time. "She said she was busy," I repeated. "I know," he said. "I need surgery because I'm bleeding internally, and she said she was busy." "I'm here," he said. Just that. Not an explanation or a defense or an attempt to reframe what my mother had done. Just, "I'm here." And then he put his hand on top of mine, around the tube and the medical tape, and he kept it there. They took me into surgery at 12:20. The last thing I saw before the anesthesia pulled me under was the clock on the wall, 12:19. The last thing I felt was my grandfather's hand on my arm at the door of the operating room, and then it was gone, and I was gone. I woke up 9 hours later in a recovery room that smelled like nothing at all. My grandfather was asleep in a chair in the corner with his arms crossed and his head tilted back against the wall. The flannel shirt was still unevenly buttoned. A different nurse, older, with reading glasses pushed up on her head, handed me a cup of water with a straw and told me the surgery had gone well. She told me Dr. Okafor would be in to see me within the hour. She asked if I needed anything. "That man," I said, nodding toward my grandfather. "Has he been here all night?" She smiled. "He didn't leave once." I looked at him sleeping in that chair. He was 67 years old, and he had driven 40 minutes in the middle of the night and signed forms for emergency surgery and sat in a waiting room for 9 hours and not left once. And he had his son's eyes. I had always known that my grandfather had the same eyes as my father, that same particular shade of brown that looked amber in certain light. And looking at him in that chair, I felt something shift in my chest that had nothing to do with the surgical site. My mother arrived at 2 in the afternoon. She came with Gary, which I had not expected, and somehow made everything worse. They were both still dressed nicely, like they had come from something rather than to something. My mother stood at the foot of my bed and said, "Thank God you're okay," in a voice that was practicing the correct emotion without quite landing it. Gary stood slightly behind her with his hands in his pockets. My grandfather was awake by then. He sat in his chair near the window and didn't stand up when they entered. He watched my mother with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not angry, exactly, but final, like a door closing. My mother looked at him. "Warren," she said. "Renata," he said. Something passed between them. An entire conversation in 2 names. My mother turned back to me and said that she was glad I was okay, and that she was sorry she couldn't get there sooner, and that it had all happened so fast, and that she'd been in a difficult situation. She was using the particular language of people who are apologizing for how you receive something rather than for what they did. I said, "You told the doctor you didn't want to drive across town for paperwork." She opened her mouth, closed it, looked at Gary. Gary said, "Caleb, let's not do this right now. You just got out of surgery." "I know," I said. "I was there." My grandfather made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. The next several days were a specific kind of strange. I was in the hospital for 4 more days recovering from surgery. My grandfather came every morning and stayed until evening. My mother came once more, briefly, on the second day. She brought flowers, which I thought was an interesting choice. Priya sent a text that said, "Hope her okay," and a single emoji. Marcus, to his credit, sent a voice message saying he was glad I was alive, which was genuine and somewhat hilarious. It was on the third day that my grandfather sat down and told me he wanted to talk to me about something. He told me he had spoken to a lawyer. He told me he had been speaking to a lawyer, in fact, for about 8 months, ever since a Sunday afternoon when I had shown up at his house with a bruise on my arm from where I'd run into a shelf in my room, and he'd seen the way I'd flinched when he'd reached toward it, not from pain, but from reflex, and he'd asked me, very carefully, whether things were okay at home. I had said yes. He had not believed me, but he hadn't pushed. Instead, he had made a phone call. He told me now that what my mother had done at the hospital, the refusal to come, the dismissal of the doctor's emergency, had created a legal situation. He told me that in Arizona, a parent's willful failure to provide consent for emergency medical care for a minor child could be grounds for a modification of custody or guardianship. He told me that he had already filed paperwork that morning. I stared at him. "You filed paperwork?" "I filed paperwork," he said. "You're 17, not 7. You understand what I'm telling you. You want to be my legal guardian. I want you to be somewhere safe," he said, "where somebody is paying attention. If you want that too, then yes." I thought about the house in Gary's neighborhood, where I slept in a room that still had the ghost of someone else's diplomas on the wall. I thought about my mother at the steakhouse in her black dress, handing me a credit card. I thought about sitting on my grandfather's back porch, eating lemon pepper chicken, and being asked real questions that waited for real answers. "Yes," I said, "I want that." My mother did not take it well. She came to the hospital that afternoon, the same day, a few hours later, and she was different this time. No flowers. The careful, practiced emotion was gone, and what was underneath it was not grief or guilt, but something that looked a lot like fury and sounded a lot like fear. She stood in my hospital room and told my grandfather that he had no right to interfere in her family, that she was Caleb's mother and she made decisions for him, that whatever had happened the night of the accident had been a misunderstanding, that she had been given incomplete information and she had responded in the moment. My grandfather let her finish. Then he said very quietly, "You told the attending physician that your son was not your only responsibility that night." "That is in the medical record, Renata. It was documented by the doctor, the charge nurse, and the hospital's administrative office. What you said is in writing." She went very still. "Additionally," he said, and I could see him choosing his words the way you choose your footing on uneven ground, "there are 3 years of patterns that a family court will be very interested in examining. I have documented them. My attorney has documented them, and Caleb is 17. In Arizona, the court gives significant weight to the preference of a minor of his age." She looked at me. I looked back at her. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. She left. Gary put his hand briefly on the doorframe on the way out, like he was steadying himself, and then he was gone too. The legal process took 4 months. I won't walk through every step of it because family court proceedings are, in practice, deeply unglamorous. A lot of forms, a lot of waiting rooms, a lot of conversations in conference rooms with adults who speak to you carefully and take notes. My grandfather's attorney was a woman named Diane, who wore the same 2 blazers in rotation and had the most organized desk I have ever seen in my life. She was very good. My mother hired a lawyer too. He argued that the hospital incident had been a communication failure, that she had been given a misleading picture of the severity of my condition, that she was a fit and attentive parent. He submitted school records showing I had decent grades and no behavioral issues, which was true, but also entirely beside the point. He called my grandfather's petition an overreach by a grieving father-in-law who had never fully accepted his son's death or his widow's remarriage. That last part landed badly. In the room, you could feel it. The judge, a woman in her late 50s with short gray hair and reading glasses she kept taking on and off, asked me directly what I wanted. It was a Tuesday morning in February. I was sitting in a chair to the left of my grandfather's attorney. I had worn a collared shirt. My grandfather sat behind me, and I could feel him back there the way you can feel weather. She asked me to describe, in my own words, what home felt like. I thought about it for a moment. Then I said, like a place where I'm tolerated, not a place where I belong. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she wrote something down. The order came 3 weeks later. Temporary guardianship transferred to Warren, my grandfather, effective immediately, pending a final hearing in 60 days. My mother was granted visitation. The final hearing, which came and went without drama, made it permanent. I moved into my grandfather's house on a Thursday afternoon in March. I carried 3 boxes and a duffel bag. He had cleared out the guest room. It had been full of storage boxes since my grandmother had passed 4 years earlier, and put in a new mattress and a desk. There were no diploma-shaped shadows on the walls. We ate lemon pepper chicken that night on the back porch. He asked me about the track season, about what colleges I'd been looking at, about whether I'd read the book he'd recommended 2 months ago. Real questions. I answered all of them. Dad used to sit in that chair, I said, nodding toward the one he always used. I know, he said. I sit in it on purpose. I didn't say anything to that. I didn't need to. My senior year was the best year of my life, up to that point. I ran the fastest times of my career. I got into Arizona State on a partial academic scholarship and a small track grant that together made the tuition manageable. My grandfather came to every home meet and 2 of the away ones. After the last meet of the season, the regional championship where I finished second, he was waiting at the finish line with a thermos of coffee and a handshake that pulled me into a hug. Second, I said, catching my breath. Second at regionals your senior year, he said. Your dad finished 3rd at state. I think you've got him. I laughed. It was a sound I didn't always recognize as mine, but that year I'd been getting more practice with it. What happened to my mother after the guardianship transfer is not something I take pleasure in describing, but I think it's part of the honest telling of this. The legal proceedings had generated attention within Gary's professional network. Scottsdale is not as large as it looks, and Gary worked in finance where reputation travels. A family court case involving questions of parental neglect during a medical emergency is the kind of thing that gets noticed. Gary was passed over for a partnership he had been expecting. Whether the 2 things were connected, I genuinely don't know, but the household became strained in ways that eventually made the connection academic. My mother called me 6 months after I moved out. It was a Sunday morning. I was sitting at my grandfather's kitchen table with a bowl of cereal and a reading assignment for my AP English class. When her name appeared on my phone screen, I held it for a moment and then answered. She said she was sorry. She said she'd been doing a lot of thinking. She said that she knew she had made mistakes and that she understood if I was angry. I told her I wasn't angry. I told her that was the honest truth, that somewhere over the previous months, the anger had processed itself into something quieter and more durable. Something closer to clarity than bitterness. She asked if we could have lunch sometime. I said maybe. I said I needed more time. I said I hoped she was okay. We hung up and I finished my cereal and did my reading assignment. My grandfather came downstairs around 9 and made coffee and asked how I'd slept. I said fine. He said good. We sat at the table in the morning light for a while, not talking, the way you can sit with people you trust. I'm 28 now. I work in Phoenix as a physical therapist, which, if you'd told 17-year-old me lying in that hospital bed, would have seemed like an unlikely but satisfying full circle. I help people understand their bodies, recover what they thought they'd lost, rebuild from damage. It's not a coincidence. My grandfather is 79. He still lives in the same house in Mesa. He still makes lemon pepper chicken. His handshake is a little looser than it was, and he moves more carefully on the porch steps. And sometimes in the middle of a sentence, he'll pause and look slightly to the left, the way people do when they're consulting a memory. But he asks real questions, and he waits for real answers, and when I sit across from him in that backyard, I am, without question or hesitation, exactly where I belong. My father's chair is still there. We don't sit in it. We leave it open between us, like a space in a conversation where someone important once spoke, and might still, if you're paying the right kind of attention. I think about that night sometimes. The white ceiling, the beeping, the clock reading 12:19, my grandfather's hand on my arm at the door of the operating room, and then the darkness, and then waking up to find him still there. He never left. That's the whole story, really. Everything else is just what happened around it.